Welcome to TWD Symbolism Analysis, hosted by me at TWD Music Box Mystery, also known as author Liesl K. Hill. This is where we totally geek out about the recurring symbols we see in the show, what they mean, how they connect, and what they foreshadow. So if you're a TWD geek, come over to the dark side. We have it, Daryl. I'm going to talk about the ways in which they do symbolism on the show. There's a lot of different ways that they do it, and I'll try to give a few examples today, not many because I don't want it to be a long video, but I just want to get you kind of familiar with it so that when we go into specific examples in the next video, you'll already kind of have a groundwork for it. So they do lots of symbolism in the show from different places and different cultures. We've seen Christian symbolism, Eastern religions, paganism, cosmology, ancient Greece and Rome, myths, legends, fairy tale templates, classic story templates. I mean, you name it, they've used it. I'll try to give you some small examples. In terms of Christian symbolism, there's a lot of biblical symbolism. We see a lot of crosses. In season 5, we saw pictures of baby Moses and the burning bush on Father Gabriel's wall in his church. Things like that. There's Eastern religions. We've seen Tibetan prayer flags. They definitely have a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil theme going on. We've seen it a lot actually this season in seasons 9 and 10, and I'll probably do a video on that eventually, but that actually comes from the Chinese tradition, I believe. It's an old Chinese myth. We see tarot card symbolism, which is where paganism comes in, cosmology, especially with the Sirius constellation, which is a big part of our Beth theories. I will definitely go into that. Ancient Greece and Rome, we see from wolf symbolism. Anyone who watches the show remembers the wolves. Some of the songs they've used, one of them was called Up the Wolves, that was pretty popular. We see different myths and legends, sometimes in the form of artwork. I know there was like Francis of Assisi statue in season 7. We always pay attention to the paintings on the walls in the background. There are fairy tales. We've seen Little Red Riding Hood templates. We've seen Snow White templates. I can go into those as we go along. And then I said classic story templates. By that I just mean things that are mainstream and pretty well-known stories but aren't necessarily actually fairy tales. So things like The Wizard of Oz, which we saw in season 5, but we actually saw that really recently in season 9, just before Rick left. He was reading The Wizard of Oz to Judith, and that's a big clue as to what was going to happen. Another way they do symbolism is through what I call dialogue foreshadows. The dialogue that they use is very carefully chosen, and a lot of times it's hard to appreciate if you can't see it, and that could be me because I'm a writer. I do better when I can see words rather than just hearing them. So let's talk specifically about deaths, because that will probably be the easiest way to do an example. You can often find foreshadows of deaths in the dialogue. Most of the time, it doesn't seem like that's what it is. They could be talking in a scene about something completely different, but the writers choose the dialogue specifically to foreshadow it in a way you wouldn't have thought. You have to go back kind of in hindsight and look at it, and then you have all kinds of light bulb moments. If somebody seems like they're going to die, but then they don't, you can usually find dialogue that suggests that as well. Things them saying, no, we're going to make it, I'm not going to die, things like that. And of course, watching that, the audience doesn't know one way or the other. They're going, oh, well, of course everybody says that. But if the person is going to die, the writers specifically don't put that dialogue in. The other thing they do is they often have whoever is dying accept their death in some way. And that may seem pretty obvious. If somebody's dying and it's obvious that they're dying, then of course they accept their death. But at the same time, if somebody doesn't accept their death, more than likely you're looking at a death fake out. So it just simply won't be there. The other thing to keep in mind is that this can change. I talked yesterday a little bit about Glenn. The first death fake out, which was started in episode 603 when he fell off the dumpster, the dialogue and the symbolism around him was much, much different there than it was at the end of the season when Negan showed up and was going to kill Glenn. And that's because it changed. That first sequence was a death fake out sequence, but the second one was not. So you could have a character that at one point says, going to live, I'm going to survive, and that's true. And then later they die, but it's because that I'm going to live, I'm going to survive doesn't apply. It changes later on the next season or something. So you have to look at the dialogue that's specifically around a certain sequence. The Walking Dead also does a lot of foreshadowing, both through symbolism and dialogue foreshadows, and they always pay them off eventually. Sometimes it can take a long time. Sometimes they'll do something really small and pay it off in the same episode. And other times it can take lots of episodes or even lots of seasons to pay off. So let's look at some examples. If they say something at the beginning of an episode and then pay it off that same episode, it's pretty obvious. You know, you might hear an example of this and think, okay, well, you're not that smart. They just said they were going to do something and they did it. And you're right, that's true. But the point is, they didn't have to put in the dialogue saying they were going to do it, especially if it's not something the characters were specifically planning. So if there was a hint at it in the beginning, then trust me, that was put there on purpose by the writers to foreshadow. One example I came up with that shows this is in that episode, if you remember, Rick leaves the prison to go out and check traps. Before he does, when they're looking at the walkers that are congregating on the fences, he sees a particular walker that looks like it's got blood coming out of its eyes. And we know now that that had to do with the virus that hit the prison right after that. But by the end of the episode, we actually see Patrick, who was not feeling well throughout the episode, die. And he opens his eyes and it looks like he's got blood coming out of his eyes. So of course, they were always planning for the virus storyline that was just beginning, but putting in that walker with the blood on his eyes was a way of foreshadowing it. When we were watching that, not very many people picked up on that. It just looked like another walker, and even if they did, they didn't know what to make of it. You almost have to watch it more than once to go, oh, okay, so that walker had the virus, that's what he was looking at. So the point is, that's put in as a foreshadow, and it's fulfilled that very same episode right at the end, and then of course that kind of catapults us into the big storyline for that first part of the season, which was the virus. Now let's talk about something that took several episodes to come to pass. At the end of season 4, everybody was split up into groups, and Tyrese and Carol and the girls ended up in one group. And if you remember, Tyrese had a cut on his arm that got kind of infected, and he had a fever because of it, and Carol was helping him take care of it. There was a lot of theories roaming around at the time that he had been bitten, probably because of the fever. People were thinking he'd been bitten, and that he was going to die from that. Well, he didn't. None of those theories really panned out. But in episode 509, which was when Tyrese died, where was he bitten? He was bitten on the arm, in the exact same place that he had been cut in season 4. And because he was bitten in 509, he had a fever. He started hallucinating. If you go back and watch those episodes at the end of season 4, there's a part where Carol is sitting up keeping watch and Tyrese has a nightmare and sort of wakes up and he's sweating. And so it's obvious that he's having bad dreams and he's got a fever and he might even be kind of hallucinating. That was a direct foreshadow of Tyrese's death and of how he would die. They were already planning for it in season 4 and setting up foreshadows of it. But that was happening in episode 413, I want to say. Yeah, it was probably the Grove where that happened, and he did not die until 509. So that is, 12 episodes ahead? It's very common for them to do that. They plan ahead like that. They have foreshadowings like that. Another one that we picked up on, and we didn't know what it meant for the longest time, is that in episode 707, I believe it was, where Carl goes to the sanctuary for a time and Negan has him sing, which was a very famous comic book arc. He gets in the truck with Jesus originally, and they're heading to the sanctuary, and there's a clock behind Jesus that says 9:30 is the time on the clock. I will do an entire episode about clocks because they're very, very important. Always pay attention to the time they show on clocks. We believe that they point to certain episodes where certain things will happen, and for a long time we didn't know what the 9:30 meant. You know, we were just going, we don't know what that means. It's probably important. They showed it to us. It's in the background, but we didn't know what it meant. Well, 9:30 is exactly halfway through the 9 o'clock hour, right? If you look at season 9, what happened at the halfway point? Jesus died. So that clock was a foreshadow of Jesus' death and that he would die in the mid-season finale of season 9. While we're on the subject, I think it's important to note that there's a lot of misdirection that goes on from the showrunners because they are very, very tight-lipped about the symbolism and how they do it. So they tend to put things out there about how nobody knew anything until right before it happened and they weren't really planning for it. And you know, I know people tend to believe that and listen to what they say. I think they try hard not to actually lie to us, but there's a lot of misdirection that goes on with that. And so I just want to point that out. If you look at the patterns, it becomes really obvious really quickly that they plan very far in advance. And Gimple has actually said that he had, since season, I don't know when he said it, it was probably around 5 or 6, he said that he had through season 15 planned. So for them to suddenly kill off a major character and claim that they kind of did it on a whim doesn't make sense anyway, because he's already told us that he has through season 15 planned. And of course things can change and things can go wrong and plans can change, but they do not change to the extent that they would have us believe. Just trust me on that. All right, so those are some examples of how things can take a long time to get paid off, but they always do get paid off. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that we talk about foreshadows and we also talk about callbacks. It is my personal theory, and I've always found it to be true thus far, that every callback is also a foreshadow. And what I mean by that is they could be calling back to something earlier, and most of the fandom will pick up on that. But what they don't pick up on is that it's usually also foreshadowing something else. And the reason that they're calling back to whatever it is to tell us what's going to happen. So I know that was really, really confusing sounding. Let me give you an example. In episode, I want to say it started in 801, they had a lot of callbacks to the pilot episode, to Rick walking around the gas station looking into cars, only this time it was Carl doing it. People picked that up big time as a major callback to the pilot episode, and it was. The little girl who played Zombie Girl in the first episode also showed up as a walker in the same episode. But what it also did was foreshadow Carl's death. Nobody knew when that episode aired, because even the spoiler site hadn't released their theory yet, that Carl was going to die in the middle of season 8. Okay, nobody knew that. But the callbacks to season 1 was also a way of foreshadowing Carl's death. And in that same scene where we had all the foreshadows was where we first met Siddiq, and Carl going back out to bring Siddiq in was what led to his death. So it was both a callback to episode 101, the pilot, and I'm not at all saying that callbacks aren't a thing, they definitely are, but it also usually foreshadows something else. So keep that in mind. Every callback is also a foreshadow. I was going to go over a little bit more about how they set up Beth as a character, but this is getting kind of long and I want to keep these short, so I will do that next time. So tune in to me. We're going to talk about Beth and how they set her up and the weirdness of her death in the next episode. See you then.